Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored that Camera has chosen to give me its Emet Award. You mentioned a lot of the prestigious people who came before me. And in fact, I understand last year you gave it to a country, Guatemala. So I'm actually following a country in getting this award. But Camera is an organization that for nearly 4 decades has been unwavering in defending the truth about Israel. And if this organization, which I respect so much, saw fit to honor me, then I guess I've been doing something right. I am truly humbled by that recognition. I want to especially thank Andrea Levin for the terrific job she has done leading Camera for so many decades. You know, in 2011, Israel's first female general was named. But the truth is that Israel had General Andrea Levin fighting on its side for nearly a quarter of a century before that. While her battlefield is different, her commitment to protect the Jewish state is exactly the same. General Levin, on behalf of Israel, I want to thank you for all you have done to defend the Jewish people and defend the Jewish state. I heard they call you General Levin at the office anyway, so. I want to thank all the other officers and soldiers at Camera for the tremendous job you do insisting that the media report the truth about Israel. At Camera, those of you who don't know, and most of you in this room do know, dozens of people do the work of hundreds, and Israel is truly grateful. Finally, I want to say something to the students who are here tonight. Can I hear the students? The first time I heard about Camera was when I was a student, when I read a column written by the late and great David Bar-Ilan. Now, I don't know if they still print Eye on the Media, but it should be required reading for anybody who wants to defend Israel. David's writings deeply influenced me, and I was fortunate to get to know him after I moved to Israel. His sharp mind and even sharper pen exposed the hypocrisy of the media and laid bare its bias against Israel for fair-minded people everywhere. In fact, one of the reasons I ended up making Aliyah was because I was outraged by Israel's vilification in the media. I understood that Israel had become the world's Jew, and that the vilification of the Jewish state meant a return of the vilification of the Jewish people. So as a proud Jew, I moved to Israel figuring that perhaps I could find a way to put my big mouth in the service of the Jewish state. And I say this to the young people who are here, because had anyone asked me at the age of 21 whether I would have moved to Israel, I would have told you there was zero chance of that happening. And had anyone told me I would one day be Israel's ambassador to the United States, I would have thought they were crazy. But here I am, and there you are, in the trenches, defending Israel and defending the truth. So who knows, perhaps a couple of decades from now, one of you will be up here as Israel's ambassador. Perhaps you will talk about your journey and about how Camera inspired you and set you on your course to a life devoted to defending Israel. Speaking of defending Israel, tonight I want to talk about a subject I've been thinking a lot about lately, what it means to be pro-Israel. A month ago, at a Holocaust memorial ceremony in the Capitol building, I called the New York Times a cesspool of hostility to Israel. Which was the most diplomatic way I could think of expressing what I really thought about the New York Times. The next day, the Times wrote an editorial about the rising tide of anti-Semitism. That editorial was arguably the best editorial the Times had written in a couple of decades on matters relating to Jews and to Israel. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Saying a New York Times editorial was the best editorial it has written about Israel is like saying that Israel has the largest gay pride parade in the Middle East. It's a low bar, a very low bar. But even within this relatively good editorial, there was one line which really stood out. The editors wrote that they, quote, have been and remain stalwart supporters of Israel. Now, saying the New York Times has been a stalwart supporter of Israel is a bit like saying that Bernie Sanders has been a stalwart supporter of capitalism. To believe that the Times is a stalwart supporter of Israel is to believe that bashing Israel nearly every day and demonizing Israel decade after decade is actually a pro-Israel position. But who can blame the New York Times for saying they are pro-Israel? After all, apparently the definition of what qualifies as being pro-Israel has undergone something of a transformation. Just a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu received a letter from 17 members of Congress urging him to reconsider a decision to deport a local director of Human Rights Watch, a man who is an open and avid champion of the BDS movement. Leaving aside the fact that the Israeli Supreme Court has already ruled that the deportation is legal, what struck me was the opening paragraph of the letter to the Prime Minister. It explained that these members of Congress were writing as, quote, strong supporters of Israel. Now, normally, that line wouldn't raise an eyebrow, even in a letter from members of Congress that was deeply critical of Israel's policy. Sometimes even the greatest of friends can disagree. In fact, there have been many times when staunchly pro-Israel members of Congress have written letters expressing concern with this or that policy. But what caught my eye was that among the signatures on this particular letter were two new members of Congress who openly support the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic BDS movement. Strong supporters of Israel indeed. Orwell lives. And in thinking about what it means to be pro-Israel, just think about another organization that constantly brands itself as pro-Israel. That organization is now calling on candidates for the presidency of the United States to declare that they support returning America to the nuclear deal with Iran. Think about how absurd it is to call that a pro-Israel position. As you know, Israel forcefully opposed that deal at the time, and the Prime Minister explained why in a speech to the American Congress. Israel believed then, as it does now, that the nuclear deal paves Iran's path to a nuclear arsenal. And Israel believed then, as it does now, that reducing sanctions on Iran would not moderate Iran's behavior, but only make its dangerous regime more dangerous. But back in 2015, a so-called pro-Israel organization could still argue that this view of the deal was far from unanimous in Israel. While most Israelis opposed it, and while nearly every Zionist party openly expressed its opposition to the deal, there were Israelis who supported it, including senior security and intelligence officials. But in 2019, that is no longer the case. Today, after seeing a dramatic increase in Iran's aggression in the wake of the nuclear deal, every senior Israeli official understands what a disaster that deal was for Israel's security. They know that it fueled Iran's war machine in the Middle East and greatly increase the chances of war against Israel. They know that the decision to withdraw from the nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions on Iran has been a great blessing for Israel's security. By starving Iran's regime of funds, the fuel for that war machine is drying up. In fact, as I have said many times, that decision by President Trump to withdraw America from the nuclear deal and restore American sanctions against Iran was the single most important decision any American president has ever made for the security of Israel. Yet here you have an organization that claims to be pro-Israel calling for a return to the nuclear deal. Such a return would mean giving a regime that vows and works to destroy Israel hundreds of billions of dollars and a clear path to nuclear weapons. It would mean endangering the people of Israel, the security of Israel, and even the survival of Israel. That this organization claims that it is pro-Israel with no support for that position in Israel just shows how absurd the pro-Israel label has become. It has become a label used not only by those who are clearly anti-Israel, but also by anyone and everyone who thinks they know what is best for Israel, who thinks their job is to save Israel from itself. The Times said as much in that same editorial. Here is what its editors said. Quote, "We believe that good faith criticism should work to strengthen Israel over the long term by helping it stay true to its democratic values." So you see, ladies and gentlemen, the Times is just trying to help. Well, I have some good faith criticism for the New York Times that might help it over the long term stay true to its democratic values. First, stop constantly demonizing the only democracy in the Middle East. Second, stop creating a moral equivalence between a democracy defending itself against terrorists and a dictatorship run by terrorists. Third, stop endangering innocent Palestinian lives by blaming Israel for the unintentional deaths caused by Palestinians who use their own people as human shields. That only encourages Palestinian terrorists to continue to use them as human shields. Fourth, stop pretending that BDS is anything but an anti-Semitic movement led by those who seek Israel's destruction. Fifth, stop pretending 71 years after Israel's birth that anti-Zionism is anything but anti-Semitism. Six, start recognizing that vilifying a democratic Israel from a comfortable office in Midtown Manhattan takes zero courage. It's not physical courage, and it's not social courage. Is there a cocktail party in this town that won't invite someone who is anti-Israel? Well, this is a cocktail party that won't invite someone that's anti-Israel. What would take real courage is sending journalists into Gaza to report the truth about Hamas's brutal rule. Sending journalists to Ramallah to report about the Palestinian Authority paying people to murder Jews, and sending people to Tehran to report about dissidents being executed for speaking out against the regime, women being imprisoned for uncovering their hair, and gays being hanged from cranes in public squares. But I digress. Let me return to the question I started with. What makes someone pro-Israel? The answer, I think, is in a book I read a few years ago after you buy Eye on the Media. This is the second book you should read, called The Devil and the Jews. It was written before the Holocaust in 1940. And its writer, Dr. Trachtenberg, Joshua I think was his first name, was trying to understand why people had all these wild ideas about the Jews. And it's an interesting book because it's written before the Holocaust, because you see, the Holocaust has distorted our own view of Jewish history, because it is such a blinding sun that it blocks out all the anti-Semitic stars in the sky. And he writes it on the eve of the Holocaust to try to figure out why people believed all these wild charges about the Jews, why they believed in blood libels, they believed in poisoning wells, they believed the Jews were spreaders of plague. And it wasn't, as many people unfortunately believe, only the ignorant masses who believed it. It was the educated people who believed it. Voltaire, the father of the Enlightenment, was a total anti-Semite. Shakespeare, the greatest writer in the English language, who wrote The Merchant of Venice and depicted Shylock, he didn't even know what a Jew looked like, because there were none in England at the time. They had been expelled. And Trachtenberg was studying this problem about why these intellectuals would believe all these terrible things about the Jews. And what he said was, what he came to understand was that people believed all these terrible things about the Jews because they wanted to believe it. The mark of the anti-Semite is somebody who wants to believe the worst about the Jews. The mark of the Philo-Semite is somebody who wants to believe the best about the Jews. As it is with the Jews, so it is with the Jewish state. The mark of someone who is anti-Israel is someone who wants to believe the worst about Israel. The mark of someone who is pro-Israel is someone who wants to believe the best about Israel. I'll give you an example. When you see a headline in a newspaper, and the headline says, Israeli soldiers killed 9 Turkish peace activists on a boat heading toward Gaza. Do you say, yeah, I could see that? Then you're anti-Israel. Or do you say to yourself, wait, something's wrong with that. That cannot be. I have to learn the facts. Now, it doesn't mean that people who are pro-Israel think Israel is perfect. I have news for everybody here. We're not perfect. We're a sovereign nation. We're an imperfect democracy. But what it means is that you give Israel the benefit of the doubt. You want to believe the best about Israel. And Israel is innocent until proven beyond a shadow of a doubt otherwise. Well, if that is the test, the New York Times gets a big fat F. You see it in the constant demonization of Israel. You see it when they twist Israeli virtues and turn them into vices, as one of the earlier speakers said. When they publish an article about pinkwashing, when Israel is the only place where gays are free in the Middle East, and they turn that into an attack against the state of Israel. You see it when they call into question Israel's very legitimacy, when they publish articles questioning whether there was a temple on the Temple Mount. I thought that was only for Yasser Arafat to do. Or when you see it when they publish op-eds of historical revisionism, as they published a few years ago from President Abbas about what happened during the War of Independence. You see it in the New York Times, putting a spotlight on every blemish in Israeli society and putting it on the front page to take marginal phenomenon and pretend as if this represents Israeli society. In July 1944, the New York Times printed a story about the deportation of 400,000 Hungarian Jews to their death and about the 350,000 more who were about to be deported. That made it into a 4-inch column on page 12. But every idiot in Israel who uproots an olive tree can get onto the front page of the New York Times. The editor's decisions, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, betrays a mindset that believes the worst about Israel and that wants its readers to believe the worst about Israel. Even worse, by casting Israel as a force for evil, this so-called, self-described, stalwart supporter of Israel has contributed to the spread of anti-Semitism. It is ironic that the same paper that constantly holds political leaders responsible for the actions that come from creating a climate of hate does not seem to appreciate what it has done over the decades by turning its own pages into a safe space for hatred of the one and only Jewish state. But ladies and gentlemen, hatred for Israel is not a new story. Nearly 30 years ago, A.M. Rosenthal, a diamond in the anti-Zionist rough at the New York Times, wrote this. It sounds like it could have been written yesterday. Quote, in the American press, television, and politics, sympathetic expression of the Israeli viewpoint has become so rare that to come across it is a bit of a shock. Interesting. 3 decades ago. If hatred of the Jewish state is not new, hatred of the Jewish people is one of the world's oldest stories. It transcends time and space, cultures, and civilization. It is the story of a people vilified like no other and persecuted like no other, subject to expulsions and massacres, pogroms, and ultimately the worst massacre of all, the Holocaust. But ladies and gentlemen, today, alongside that old story, there is a new story. It is the story of a stateless people that has become a sovereign nation again. It is the story of a powerless people that is no longer defenseless against its enemies. Ladies and gentlemen, as hatred for the Jewish people and the Jewish state returns, it is easy to be despondent. Don't be. Today, the Jewish people are a powerless people no more. We have the ability to defend ourselves on the battlefield, and we have the ability to defend ourselves in the courts of public opinion. You know, the most remarkable thing about being Israel's ambassador is that there are Israel ambassadors. There are ambassadors of a sovereign Jewish state, that the Jewish people have a voice. That is the most remarkable thing. So take comfort in knowing that in the capital of this great country, in Washington, D.C., there is no ambassador of Babylon. There is no ambassador of Imperial Rome. There is no ambassador of a 1,000-year Reich. But there is an ambassador of the state of Israel. And with a strong and powerful Jewish state, with faith in our hearts and truth on our side, and with pro-Israel friends like the 500 camera supporters in this room, rest assured the truth and Israel will prevail. Thank you.